I don't know what made me open the box that evening. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon sun slipped softly through the curtains and landed across the old wooden floor. Or maybe it was the quiet one of those deep, heavy silences that makes the whole house feel like it's holding its breath. Whatever the reason, my hand moved toward that box almost on its own. I had seen it 1,000 times, tucked away beside Nancy's dresser, untouched for years, treated almost like a sacred thing. And yet, that evening, something inside me whispered that the past was ready to be heard. It was Reagan's box, the one he never spoke about, the one Nancy kept close but never opened. Before I even lifted the lid, I felt a tightening in my chest, the kind of feeling you get when you're standing at the edge of a moment you know you'll never forget. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness, it was something deeper, like the past itself had been waiting patiently for someone to finally reach in and touch it. When I opened the lid, I didn't find medals or speeches or anything meant for the public eye. No polished photos, no ceremonial objects. Instead, I found something small, something quiet, something that felt heavier than the rest of his entire life combined. There was a letter, a single sheet of faded paper tucked inside an envelope, so old it looked like it might crumble at the corners. There was no name on it, no date, no explanation, just one line, written in Reagan's unmistakable handwriting. If anyone is reading this, I'm sorry. I froze. That line alone told me more than any biography ever had. Reagan wasn't apologizing as a president. He wasn't apologizing to the American people. This was something private, something deeply personal, something he never wanted another soul to see. My hands trembled as I lifted the letter from the envelope. The paper was thinner than I expected, worn from age. And before I even began to read, I felt that strange, familiar warmth behind my ribs, the warmth that comes when someone who's no longer here suddenly feels close again. The first sentence hit me harder than I was prepared for. I hope this is never found, because if it is, then the weight I carried alone now belongs to another. The words felt heavy, not political, not formal, just painfully human. I kept reading. He wrote about a night long before he was president, before Hollywood, before the world knew his name, a night when he sat alone in a cold, dimly lit room at 2 a.m. and wondered whether he had already failed the people he loved most. He didn't describe the setting much, just enough to let you feel the chill in the air, the loneliness pressing in around him, the way the silence seemed to echo. He wasn't the confident leader people later saw on television. He wasn't the steady, smiling man behind the podium. That night, he was just a young man carrying a mistake heavier than his own shoulders could bear. What mistake? Who did he fail? Why did this moment haunt him so deeply? He never said directly, but the emotion in every line made it clear that it changed something inside him. I noticed something else, too. The ink had smudged in several places, not from age, not from water damage. These smudges came from tears that had fallen before the writing dried. And somehow, that silent evidence of his pain was more powerful than anything he could have written. He continued, I failed someone who trusted me, and every good thing I've done since has been my attempt to grow into the man I wasn't that night. I felt myself leaning closer to the paper, as if getting physically nearer could reveal more, a name, a hint, a clue. But Reagan never identified the person. All he revealed was the emotion, the regret, the heaviness, the sense that this single moment shaped everything that followed. Between the pages, I found a photograph, a small black and white picture of Reagan in his early 20s, sitting on the steps of what looked like a small town building. His head was bowed, his hands were clasped tightly. He looked defeated, younger than I'd ever seen him, vulnerable in a way the world never knew. On the back of the photograph, in faint pencil, he had written, "The night everything changed." My breath caught. It wasn't just a letter, it was a confession he never dared to speak aloud. And the photograph was proof that the memory had carved itself into him so deeply, he carried it, quietly, for the rest of his life. I turned back to the letter, and the words grew softer, more fragile, as if he was writing through exhaustion. There was someone there that night. Someone who sat beside me without saying a word. Sometimes silence is the only thing that can keep a man from breaking. Someone sat with him. Someone stayed with him through the darkest moment of his early life. Someone who expected nothing in return. But Reagan never named them. He spoke about the years that followed Hollywood, his early political days, his gradual rise. But woven through those memories was a quiet thread of gratitude. Gratitude toward someone whose presence had steadied him on a night when he felt lost. Then I reached a line that made my heart ache. Nancy saved me twice. Once, in a way, the world knows. And once in a way, no one ever will. What was the second way? Why didn't he explain? The letter didn't say, but the tenderness in those words felt like the touch of a hand on your shoulder. A reminder that even the strongest men lean on love more than they ever admit. As I read on, the writing shifted again. The letters grew slightly uneven, as if his hand had begun to shake. If the day comes when my mind begins to fade, I pray it fades gently. I pray the people I've loved never carry the weight of my mistakes. And I pray that when my time ends, I remember at least this: I was forgiven more than I deserved. There was no signature. No closing line, just one final sentence, smaller and lighter than the rest, as if he had written it with a trembling hand. Tell Nancy I kept my promise. I stared at that line for what felt like a long time. What promise? What moment tied his entire life to those 5 quiet words? Before I could answer that, I noticed something beneath the letter, something folded so many times the edges had nearly worn through the paper. I reached for it, and the moment I unfolded it, I understood that the letter wasn't the whole story. It was only the beginning, because what I found next changed everything. I thought I knew about Ronald Reagan. When I unfolded the second paper hidden beneath the letter, the first thing I noticed was how fragile it felt, thin as dried leaves, the edges worn, nearly translucent. It had been handled many times, folded and unfolded by a man who didn't want anyone to know this part of him existed. Reagan must have held it often. Not to read it, but to remember something he kept locked deep inside himself. As the paper opened fully, the faint lines of handwriting appeared far lighter than the first letter, as if he wrote it late at night, tired, or maybe afraid his own thoughts were too heavy for the page. The first sentence made my breath hitch. This is the truth I could never bring myself to say aloud. Not something political, not something historical, something far more personal. He continued. I have spoken of many things in my life, of courage, of hope, of strength. But the truth is, there was a moment when I felt none of those things. A moment when the man people later came to trust had not yet learned how to trust himself. Right then, it felt like I was listening to a voice from another teamer, young Reagan. Before fame, before the stage lights, before the world expected anything of him. A version of him, unsure of who he was becoming. The paper began to reveal a story so quiet, so intimate, that I found myself holding my breath just to avoid breaking its fragile spell. He described a night in the early 1930s. He didn't name the town, but the setting he painted was unmistakable. A small, dim street lined with single lamps, a light dusting of snow settling on the ground, the kind of cold that made the silence sharper. He was a young man then, unsure of his place in the world, wrestling with a choice he'd made that left him feeling more alone than he had ever felt before. He sat on the steps of a small town building, the same building from the photograph tucked inside the letter. I could almost see him there, the young man with his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly, the weight of regret pulling his shoulders inward. He didn't describe what happened that night in detail. He didn't need to. You could feel the sorrow in the pauses between his words. I made a decision I thought was right, but it cost someone I cared about more than I understood at the time. Whatever the decision was, it shaped him deep, permanently, and then he wrote something that lingered in my mind long after I read it. We all have a night we wish we could return to, if only to tell our younger selves to stand steadier. I kept reading, and the story took a turn not toward darkness, but toward something quiet and unexpected. He wasn't alone on those steps. A stranger approached him, someone older, carrying the kind of calm that only comes from having lived enough years to understand sorrow. The man didn't introduce himself, didn't ask questions, didn't offer advice. He just sat beside him. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't judge me. He didn't ask why I was there. He just sat, close enough to let me know I wasn't alone, but far enough to let me breathe. Reagan described that moment in a way that made the air around me feel still. Sometimes a man doesn't need a solution. He needs someone to sit with him until he can stand on his own again. That simple, human gesture changed him. He wrote that the stranger eventually stood up, nodded once as if to say, "You'll be all right," and then walked into the night. They never exchanged names. They never saw each other again. But Reagan remembered him. For decades, I built my life on that moment, he wrote, not on speeches or applause, but on the kindness of a man whose name I never learned. Reading that, I suddenly understood something profound about him. The public saw the strong, steady Reagan, the leader, who spoke about hope even in the hardest times. But beneath that was a young man shaped not by ambition, not by politics, but by the quiet presence of a stranger who offered nothing but company on a cold night. The next lines brought a lump to my throat. I carried that night with me into every room, every decision, every moment the world demanded strength. I knew what it meant to stand alone, and I knew what it meant to not be left alone. The letter shifted again, turning tender. He began writing about Nancy, how she didn't just enter his life, but illuminated it. He described the first moment he realized she wasn't just a part of his days, she was the center of them. When I met Nancy, I recognized the same quiet presence I felt that night in the cold, a warmth that asked for nothing but offered everything. He wrote about the way she looked at him when he doubted himself, the way her hand found his when the world felt heavy, the way her voice, gentle and steady, pulled him back from the edges of exhaustion. And then came a line that was almost too soft to read. The first promise I ever made that I was certain I would keep was to her. But he never said what the promise was. Not directly, not in plain words. He only hinted. I promised her she would never face the night alone, as I once did. I felt my chest tighten. Those words would echo later in their lives, in the hard years, in the fading memories, in the moments when she stood by his side, long after his mind began to slip. The letter grew more emotional the farther I read. He wrote about moments he wished he could relive, quiet evenings at home with Nancy, conversations that stretched late into the night, times when their laughter filled the house in a way he feared he would forget someday. And then, his fear, the one he never said aloud. If my memory ever leaves me, I pray it leaves last the part of me that loves her. The vulnerability in that sentence almost broke me. This wasn't the voice of a president. This was the voice of a husband terrified of losing the one thing he could not bear to forget. Toward the end, the writing shifted. The lines grew shakier, the sentences shorter. There will come a time when I no longer know the day or the room I am in, when I no longer recognize the faces that once shaped my life. And then, softer still, if that time comes, I pray she remembers I kept my promise. I set the letter down and closed my eyes. The house felt even quieter now, not empty, just full of a presence that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. Everything suddenly made sense. The way Reagan softened in his later years, the way Nancy never left his side, the way she held his hand, not out of duty, but devotion, the promise he made in his youth, born from the pain of that cold night and the kindness of a stranger, had guided his entire marriage, and he kept it every day until his final breath. When I placed the letters back into the box, I felt as if I were closing the final chapter of a story he never meant the world to hear. Not because it was shameful, not because it was secret, but because it was tender, fragile, sacred. I placed the lid gently on the box, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the soft light from the window fall across the room. I thought about the man the world remembered, strong, confident, full of optimism. The young man the world never met. The one sitting on cold steps, uncertain, afraid, grateful for a stranger's presence. And in that quiet moment, I understood something. Some stories aren't meant to be public. Some are meant to be felt, softly, quietly, like a hand resting on your shoulder when the night feels too big. This was one of those stories, and now it belongs to anyone who needs to hear it. If this story touched you, even a little, I hope you stay with us. There are more quiet memories, more gentle moments, more pieces of Reagan's life waiting to be shared. Your voice, Your memories, your thoughts, they matter here. So if this story meant something to you, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.